Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We are thrilled to have photographer Igor Posner and poet Mary Di Lucia as tonight's guest speakers. Originally from St. Petersburg, Igor moved to California in the early 90s. He studied molecular biology at UCLA, where he also took an interest in photography. By 2006, he had embarked on a full-time career as a photographer. Returning to his hometown of St. Petersburg, Leningrad, back when you're born to it, right?
Yes.
He began work on Past Perfect Continuous, which was published by Red Hook Editions in 2017. Mary Di Lucia holds a doctorate in comparative literature from Harvard University and a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from NYU. She has won awards as a writer, a poet, and as an educator. Currently, Mary serves as faculty in the Language and Thinking Institute at Bard College and is teaching Hamlet at Fishkill Correctional Institute through the Bard Prison Initiative. There is a long and distinguished tradition of collaborations between writers and photographers, but seldom do they result in the twin publication of companion books, as was the case with Past Perfect Continuous and accompaniments. So please help me welcome Igor Posner and Mary Di Lucia to our lecture series.
So I'd like to just quickly start, for those who don't know me, just by introducing myself. I was born in former Soviet Union, moved to California in the very early 90s, right after the collapse of Soviet Union. I moved to California and I studied something else other than photography. I studied molecular biology, developmental biology in order to become a doctor. And but it never felt quite right to me. But I knew I was doing maybe a practical thing for an immigrant to just just want to mention how photography came into my life. I don't have a very romantic story from my childhood where I would just stumble upon my grandfather's old camera. There's nothing of that happened. None of the members of my family are artists. But when I was studying at the university, I was given a birthday gift. And that gift was a point-and-shoot digital camera. So even though I grew up in the age of film, my journey with photography started actually with a digital point-and-shoot camera. So, and once I had this camera in my hand, I think somehow things really changed. I became totally infatuated with what it could do and the freedom that it gives me. Freedom, first of all, not to go from point A to point B, but rather to explore other things. So yeah, so that was the beginning, and in terms of my development, so even though so I was born in Russia, in Soviet Union, but obviously I didn't have any formal photography education there, so I don't fall into that lineage of Russian Soviet school. But my influences are primarily the New York Photo League. That was always been my inspiration. And I come back to it and learn. So that was so that was the beginning of my journey. And now tonight I'd like to show you two projections. One is of my very early work, and I think it's important to for me, so at least I'm very curious to see the development of any artist And I think it would be very educational for everyone to see the early work. It's a short projection. And then we're going to move to another projection, which is just a bit longer, which is about my work in Russia and is a topic of today's evening. So that's our plan. Okay, so that let's begin with the visual part. And I think it's important to first also stimulate each other visually, maybe assault visually. So any way you want to put it. So let's see. Let's look at the photo, the images. So just to give you a little bit of a context, this work was done primarily in brothels in Tijuana, in Mexico, in transitional hotels in downtown Los Angeles, sort of very, difficult areas. But yeah, that was the beginning. Okay, and then Let's look at the work from Russia, which is the topic of today's gathering. Okay. So we, I think Mary and I, we really want to be very like generous and educational. So as I speak, if you have any questions, don't just feel free to interrupt me. I'll be more than happy to answer any sort of questions. Yes. Hi. Okay. The question is about the cameras. What kind of cameras I use? Yes, it's always difficult to answer. I use rangefinders for 35 millimeter, and toy cameras for medium format. Yeah, it's all. I use film cameras. Yeah, but the cameras doesn't really matter. It just, yeah, it's very, it's very individual, and there's no one camera that is right for you or not. So it just, yeah. But that's my choice. Okay, thank you. So just a few words about this project. As I've mentioned, I moved to California in the very early 90s, and I lived there for 14 years, and I never gone back to Russia. Up until in 2006, I decided to take photography full time, and then at that moment it felt like okay, maybe it's the right time for me to come back. There was no ambition to have a book or to work on a book. There was just a pure hunger to take photos. Because as I mentioned, I was totally infatuated with photography, and it seemed like after wandering for several years in California and Mexico, it felt like for me the right place to go to take photos. And so I moved to my hometown, St. Petersburg. I lived there for 4 years, or just to be precise, it took 4 years to finish just a shooting. My approach was to maybe shoot to photograph for 3 or 4 months, then go back home, develop, spend some time in Select, spend some time in Darkroom, and then go again. And then I think my last trip lasted almost a year. I had what's it called, a two-way ticket, but I just missed my flight, and I stayed for almost a year. So that's where it started. Now, the moving to the book and how the idea of a book was conceived. So after some time, it felt like, okay, I think it's an honest body of work. That's how I felt like, and I felt like I think I have maybe I have something to say, and I started editing, and I failed miserably. I really didn't know how to edit the work. It was just a new, entirely new dynamic for me. And yeah, so it took me several years to actually almost suffer with this, to develop some skills as an editor, and as a visual writer, almost. So about this work again, even though there is obviously there's a personal story behind it. I have a history with the place, but that personal story is secondary. I think that for me, to have a personal story, I think it's a good starting point just for yourself as an artist. So that's where you sort of begin. But then you have to be open to a journey, kind of a journey itself. It's very important. So you start, usually with me, I start with one idea or one concept, and then I end up with entirely sort of like different ending or conclusion. That's just that's just how I am, I think. But the journey is very important. And then what else is important, very important in my opinion, is that you need to take some time to reflect upon your work, upon what happened to you after a very intense period of shooting. Or at least that's how it is with me. I think that the shooting is a very, very, very physically enduring thing for me. And then there's a period of complete dormancy. I exhausted. So, but at the same time, within those periods, I try to reflect, because that separation gives me maybe more of a objective angle for the story, for something that I want to convey to people, and then also that separation of time. Also, I think it gives you another important quality is that you're how would I put it? Anyway, you need some. My point is, you need some time. Like, let's say, like wine, you need to give it some time to ferment. That's essentially the point. Okay, so that's how the idea of the book was conceived. Now, I think. Let me mention. Yes, hi. Oh, the question was about the shooting process, whether I was looking for a certain type of photographs or just walking the streets, whether it's a random process or more of a kind of a focused and brain processed, etc. That's it's always a dilemma. I think that what you want ideally is to always be open to just any possibilities. So my approach is always to be, or at least my reminder to myself is to be opportunistic all the time, because the problems often arise that, okay, I think I need that shot, that particular shot, and it makes me blind to everything else, to what's going on with me. So I start chasing that shot, and in the end, it's a disappointment and a waste of time. So just to answer your question, I think, yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, I think it's both. Certainly, there were certain places that I was interested in. It's St. Petersburg is a very, very beautiful town, and it's very polished, especially now. Putin's Russia. It's very polished, but there's a lot. There's a lot behind. There's a lot of history and literature, and some social aspects. So that's yeah. Okay, I'll stop here. Yeah.
So you chose black and white film as your media.
Yeah.
Why that, not digital, given the time frame that you shot?
Mm-hmm. Well, during the course of my development, I think I've mentioned in the very, very beginning that even though I grew up in a film era, I started my photography with digital. But then, during my development, as I came across film, it felt like the right language for this particular work. I think it's pointless to argue in the sense of film versus digital in your preferences, but what's important is the choice of express, I mean, film is a certain language, and the digital is a certain language. So that's where, excuse me, that's where I feel that this is the right choice to express. Oh, all right. Okay. So where were we? Yeah. So let me just let me talk a little bit about three things: my approach to work, selection, and darkroom work. So the first one is my approach, and again, I just want to mention that there is no right or wrong approach. As you meet many other photographers, everyone has their own philosophy, and I respect that. And there's no need to argue over it. You know, whatever works for you. So for me, it is important. I think the shooting itself, and this is the question. Sometimes I teach workshops, and the question that is often asked is, well, how do you shoot? Do you shoot with your heart? Do you shoot with your brain? You know, do you shoot with your soul? None of the above. I shoot with my stomach. Really, you have to be hungry. It's a very, you know, it's a very primitive feeling, but this is the only way I know. Otherwise, yeah, it just doesn't work for me. So that's that. And then in terms of shooting itself, I always advocate just to be loose, with your wrist, just to be loose. The beauty of photography is that by making a mistake is a very important in photography, and I think actually some of you might know Peter Galassi, I think, right, the former curator of MoMA. I think I was listening to his lecture, and he mentioned that the very unique feature of photography is that photographers always make mistakes. You can make a mistake in exposure or many other things, and then you look through your negatives, and then you have eureka moment. Oh, my camera could do that. So that's, I think it's fantastic. It's very important. So to be, and then so this. It's important to be kind of open to mistakes. So that's kind of a process. Again, this blurriness, okay, in the photos, etc. Right. So this is not. I mean, this is not my primary intention. There are photos that are perfectly in focus, but I also, you know, I try to be loose. You know, so and then when you look at your negatives, there's another level of discovery. You know, you could discover something. So and then, but, you know. What else? And then so let's yeah, let's talk about a little bit about selection. I think, and I want to start with. For me, I mean, there are always images that are personal. But in terms of selection, I think it's important to recognize photos which carry some maybe universal existential quality. That's what I'm always looking for. So it's less about me, but more about to maybe for me recognizing or finding new ways to say very old universal things. So that's that's what I look for when selecting images. Plus, you know, there's certainly I think that an image should carry some mystique, some mystery. It's always interesting. That's where you come back to it. So because it's you know, it could be a fertile ground for your imagination. It's an important quality for me. I also like cinematic quality. I'm kind of a junkie for cinematic. You know, it's just beautiful. Yeah, and some photos they just have this an element of contemplation, which is kind of a pose, and that's also important. Yeah, and so, and then darkroom is very important part of my workflow, at least for this particular work, because the other projects that I'm working on, it's also film, but it's in color, and I don't use darkroom as much for it. But anyway, so darkroom is very important to bring a certain potential within a negative that it's already there. So for me, it's important, and then it is less about certain style, but more about maybe substance. And I think a darkroom allows to bring, or even digital editing, it doesn't matter really, to bring this to the surface. And also darkroom has an element of surprise, a mistake. You always make mistake. You know, it's so difficult to make a perfect print. But that's part of the workflow. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on, and yeah. So construction of photographic narrative. Yeah. So this is anyway very. It's a subject that's lately. I mean, I take huge interest in it, and as I said, when I first started editing this work, I failed miserably. Horrible experience, but also learning, fantastic. And then, so I developed that skill over time, and I think as I was editing this book, I was constantly making notes to myself, and they're more like reminders. So what happens is you have maybe a couple of days very productive. So you have these creative juices flowing, and you want them to go on, but then you hit a writer's block, and it's so what do you do next? So and I always go back to this very, very, very basic reminders, and so I'm going to read some of them to you just to share. I mean, there's nothing very personal, but it's just a few reminders that helped me to work on constructing a narrative here. So. A photographic narrative essentially is a set of variations on a theme, okay? And the basic idea for me is to shape a rhythm from the images, not necessarily from my brain, but you know, from the photos themselves. And the reasons are often, at least for me, they should be intuitive rather than analytical. Okay? And then it's very essential that when you look through the book, when you browse the book, that a viewer becomes a participant and almost a protagonist of what I'm showing, and because the way you construct narrative, you should leave some space vacant for the viewer. In other words, you I think when you're ambiguous, it's a virtue. So it's because it leaves some space for imagination, and it invites a viewer to participate. Okay. So at one point the narrative was done, and again, a book I was thinking about. So how much text I should give should be in a book, because I always prefer not to have any subtitles other than, well, maybe a location in a year, but I prefer not to be descriptive about the photos. I had a certain idea that instead of having a text to accompany my book, which is kind of a philosophical text or explains the nature of work, instead of all of that, to have a fictional story that doesn't necessarily speak directly of the images, but it sort of goes in parallel with the story. You know, there was a period of when I was considering many different writers, and then yeah, I thought of Mary, because actually she sent me a few pieces that I really like. I mean, they left a mark on me. I thought they were funny and imaginative. Of course, I had doubts in the sense of, well, does she have an understanding of photography or where I'm coming from? But then I thought it's kind of irrelevant, really. And in the end, so I approached Mary with this insane idea. And Mary.
Thanks, Igor. And as Igor is speaking and talking about being a witness or making a work of art that someone else can enter into, I feel like, in a way, I'm a witness maybe to you for what that experience can be. You know, I have some notes here. I have, let's see, Igor wanted me to talk about my early work in childhood. I wrote down, I'll give you the quick version: raised by wolves, bookstores, bicycles, in search of something, boys, love. Accidentally got a PhD. I was good at school. And I took a train trip to St. Petersburg in 1991 during a first marriage. It didn't really work out, but in other words, I'm a writer. I've had 9 lives. Right now, in fact, I'm a New York City teaching fellow in the Bronx, teaching 8th grade English special education. It's amazing. And this is what Igor's work also is saying, and his ethos, his ars poetica: remain open as an artist. I've written poems, I've written stories. I don't have and didn't have a book. I sent Igor some essays and poems I'd written. So when he approached me to work on this project, I was too polite to say no, but I really had no idea what he wanted or whether I would respond or, whether I could do it. Why me? And he would never tell me. And that is part of, I think, the space that one kind of genre can give another. Igor never told me. His photographs never told me anything. So a container was created that another being could enter. And mysteriously, I did enter. I got this folder, and there's an image here of 3 boys that you might recall. And I remember I was sitting at my desk, and a student came to talk to me, and she was like, wow. You know, the image was up on the screen. So these things speak to you. So for about 3 months, I tried to write something that I didn't know what it would be. But I looked. I looked at those images over and over again, and I entered that story at many points. And I couldn't write anything. And I tried to grill Igor. What's going on in this picture? How did you do this? Nothing. I knew a little bit about his journey to St. Petersburg and his journey as a photographer. It ended up that I took a plane. I have a little child. I took a plane to Paris, where I had kind of gone to when I was 21 to find myself. And I hadn't been back there in 25 years. That's how old I am. Because I wanted to do what Igor did. I wanted to go back somewhere to that was the past and the present at the same time, because I dreamed about it. And I thought, maybe if I go there and do this crazy thing, I'll break my, I don't know, photographer's block. And I actually brought a camera with me. And what happened was I was walking around and trying to, the old place where I used to live in Paris, and I couldn't, I had my notebook, didn't write anything, and I saw this guy, and he was taking a photograph of all these flowers, this really old guy. And I went and I took a photograph of him, and as I'm taking the photograph, he looked at me, almost like the way Igor looked at me and I looked at his work. And we sat down, this man and I, because he caught me being a spy or a witness, which I guess photographers are, but you don't have to admit that. And we were sitting there, and he said, "Isn't everything so very pleasant and agreeable?" I was like, well, life really is miserable a lot of the time, and we suffer. Photographers suffer, artists suffer. But this got into me, and the next day I found myself opening a notebook and writing something, and it's in here. Now, Igor wanted me to write something for his book. What happened over time was that I wrote the opening piece for his book about 35 times. There were 35 different ones until Igor finally said, "Mary, I think you might have a book of your own here." And maybe you've also noticed there's an image that flips by that's on the cover of my book, and it actually looks like me. And Igor took this picture, I think, long before we ever met. So out of thin air, he conjured up me to write something for his book, and then with his other magical hand, he conjured up a book for me they're not collaborations, they're not direct responses. Maybe it's what happens when a photographer walks around and is in an environment for a while. But, well, I think it attests to the power of art. And I would like to read you the first piece, which actually echoes the first piece, or the piece that I wrote for Igor's book, and I still don't know whether it's a story, a poem, an essay, or what it is. So it's called "It Is Yours." Can you hear me okay? Yep. All right. Now remember, this person speaking is pretty much me, a person who knows nothing about photography. It is yours. I have heard of a small black box, a chamber with a pinhole. Into it funnels the light of the blaze of a tree in a summer day, or a street light. And when this image, compressed into the light, enters the pinhole, into the black box, the image is upside down. The branches of the tree are on the floor of the box. The roots are the ceiling. It has bounced inside this impossible confined space and has landed upside down. But who will write the image? Who will sort this out, decipher and order it? Who even knows it exists? How is it for the tree blazed by the light now inside that small black box? And who is there with it? A person so small, a child, who does not understand how images are made or how they are sorted one to the other and pressed together to make something, a sequence of events, a continuum, a sentence of images. What is it telling us? What does it want to say, the tree, the image? Who is it who sees what is being seen and made re-seeable inside that sealed chamber? The black box is a book with a white box inside of it. The child is inside of the white box. How can he get out? Must he leave by the pinhole? What is reality? This is his question. Is it the tree he once saw there, the tree who came through and laid down his head? The tree, the same tree that may be there now at the corner of the park, its leaves lost in some storm. The tree he can touch again, but it is not the same. He must not look at it at all. He can only shut his eyes and remember it. Perhaps that is, in the impossibility of truth, an attempt at history, which is a remembering of something which may or may not have been there at all in the way it is remembered. Its remembering is what is to be remembered. That fact, that its remembering was remembered, is the only fact, the only truth. So the book is on the shelf. The images inside it are pressed next to each other in ways when they occurred, they never encountered one another. They have been pressed into a new time, and here they are safe. They make a story in the child's mind. His eyes are the captions, his fingertips, as the pages turn, are the words. It would be impossible to describe each one, its associations, its moment, the choice, what each gesture cost, its intricacies, the parts of it that flitted away. Each image chosen represents something else, lost. History is impossible. The intense consciousness of reality can crush us were we to capture each detail. The book is on the shelf, and it is open in our minds at the same time. It is something real he can hold in his hand. Here, take it. It is yours. So I think this book is really my my gratitude to photographers and to Igor Posner. So thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is a relationship between the photographic narrative and music, and my answer is the relationship is immense, because what happens with constructing a photographic narrative is that you often come across repetitions. It's a huge problem. So you sort of feel, okay, I think I already said about that, so am I repeating this? But in music, the beauty of music is, I mean, I'm referring to classical music, is that the way it's constructed for the main part is that everything is a variation on the same theme, but played in a different key, and I think that's where it flows. Right? I mean, the story is important because there's a visual writing, but for visual writing is a challenge, and actually a literary writing is a challenge, because for me, I think there should be a certain sense of rhythm, and I think I've mentioned that it's rather intuitive than analytical. It's always this collision. So I think, yeah, that's where I think the music is important. The way I actually studied a basic construction of classical composition when I was working on this, when I was like really had a block. So I thought maybe that would help, and it did in some sense. So even though it might not make sense to you, but it helped me, and I just want to share this with the audience.
Just on the theme of Russia,
Yes.
you know, if you the beautiful text that you read didn't necessarily bring up any Russian motifs, but was your trip to St. Petersburg or your connection to Russian communities in any way significant in writing this, or did Russia totally?
Oh, that's an excellent question because it was extremely significant. In fact, part of the mystery, I think, that Igor is talking about, or the many coincidences, was not only that I had been to Petersburg when it was at that time when I was impressionable, but that motif continued to thread through my own life. And I'm actually, my partner is someone who lived in Russia for 10 years. And so I was already very steeped in Russian sensibility, Russian culture, Russian literature, Russian soul. So certainly, so in this book, there are pieces that some people asked me, were they translated from Russian? So that is also a way that the works are speaking to each other. And I think I mentioned to some of you, even in writing and editing, when I got back here, I would take the train out to Brighton Beach, and the B train in particular, and I would edit and write right on the beach. And that's like when it happens, like with photography, when it comes to you, you write it down. So
It's funny because the first time that I read your book was on the B train to Brighton Beach.
I remember, and you posted a picture of a student reading my book on the B train where I had written the book, and you didn't know that. It was wild. And today I was so nervous about this talk that I left New York City Teaching Fellows early and told them I had a very important appointment, and I went to Brighton Beach and I swam for an hour and I got some Russian food also. So it's all in there.
And the books are available. You can buy this one as a standalone, or Mary's as a standalone, or you can buy them as a bundle and save money. All right. So these two books are almost sold out. We're at the end of our run, so take advantage. And I think Mary and I will be happy to sign it for you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.